Hi guys, welcome back to GoblinBlitz episode 2. Today I wanted to talk about the gameplay and rules that I've planned for my TCG, as well as some of my thoughts on what makes a good combat system in a trading card game. But first, I'd like to show you the finished version of the card that I designed in the last video. Here's the finished card for the drawing that I made in the last video. It's a Goblin Mercenary, and it has a pretty cool ability where you can discard a card to give it additional range, as you see here indicated in the range area of the card. We'll get into a little bit more detail on what that means later in the video. In my last video, I mentioned how I wanted to deviate from the typical TCG combat system of playing your cards onto the battlefield, after which they can pretty much just attack and maybe block. There have been a ton of variations on this simple combat system, but the basic idea of it is used in a lot of the biggest TCGs like Magic and Pokemon. Now there's nothing wrong with using a version of this in your TCG. In fact, a lot of the reason why it's so popular is because it works really well. It gives players a means to progress the game through attacking, and it doesn't overcomplicate things, so it still leaves plenty of room for additional rules or abilities. So if this combat system works so well, why would I want to do something different with my game? Well, the main answer is movement. While the standard combat system is great for basic attacking and blocking, it can't really portray anything beyond that. Your creatures can't traverse the battlefield like they would in a real fight. They can't move away from enemies to dodge attacks, or charge forward for a more powerful hit. It's this element of movement that I want to convey with the combat system that I'm currently working on. The general structure is like this. Each player has two decks, which is the monster deck, where you get your monsters from, and the tactics deck, which is essentially a spells deck that has cards with a one-time effect and then goes to the graveyard. The battlefield is a 6x6 board, and each player's decks occupy the bottom left and right corners on their side of the field. Monsters are played onto the board, starting with the spaces adjacent and diagonal from your two decks. Once you have a monster on the board, you can play new monsters off of the ones you already have, and the Blitz mechanic can be used to play one of your monsters off of any monster an opponent controls to allow it to attack them immediately, at the cost of that monster dying at the end of the turn. Monsters on the board can move to any adjacent empty space, not including diagonals this time. Each monster can only take one action per turn, which can consist of moving, attacking, or activating an ability. This box in the bottom corner indicates which spaces a monster can attack in relation to where it is on the board. So this symbol represents where the monster is, the targets represent the spaces it can attack, and in this case this monster also has some additional targets that it can attack when it activates its ability. I think to prevent stalemates, I'm going to add a rule that each monster must take an action each turn if possible. My TCG will use persistent damage, meaning when a monster is attacked, that damage stays on the card until it dies or otherwise leaves the battlefield. Think like the Pokemon TCG. Persistent damage is kinda cool because it allows players to plan for the long game, deciding which monsters to attack so that they can set up for a kill on a future turn. But it does also come with some issues. The main one is counters. If you're using persistent damage, you also have to have something to keep track of that damage. This usually means damage counters or dice, both of which take up space on the cards, which means they can get kind of cluttered and hard to read. This also kind of limits your design freedom, because you can't be like Magic and have like a million different kinds of counters, because it'll be impossible to tell which ones are which. This could also be a problem specifically for my game, because if you're moving the cards around a lot, you don't want to have a bunch of counters that could fall off. So, overall, persistent damage is kind of annoying. I'm going to try to limit these problems though by keeping the damage values fairly low. This isn't going to be like Pokemon where you have a range of like 10 to 400 in terms of damage. The maximum HP will only be 20, so that you can represent all of your monster's damage with a single d20. In terms of winning the game, the goal is to get to your opponent's side of the board and attack their bases, which are their two decks, causing them to put a card from their deck into their graveyard for each point of damage dealt. You win when you reduce either one of their decks to 0 cards, not when they draw from an empty deck, like in Magic. This is because when you draw, you get to choose which deck to draw from, so this would make it a lot harder to win because your opponent could just choose to draw from the deck that you hadn't attacked. Okay, before we end the video, I wanted to talk about one more thing, and that's card draw and randomness in TCGs. Obviously, because you get to choose which deck to draw from, there's a lot less randomness involved with GoblinBlitz as opposed to many other games. Some people may consider this a good thing, others may not like it as much, but I think it's at least a pretty interesting mechanic that not a lot of games have. Luck of the draw is kind of an essential mechanic in card games, and that's still going to be present in GoblinBlitz, but the aspect of having two separate decks gives you a little bit more control over what you draw. I wanted my TCG to be fairly skill-based, since it never feels good to know you lost due to luck, and there wasn't much you could have done to prevent it. Another thing I forgot to mention that contributes to this non-luck based gameplay is that there are no lands in GoblinBlitz. Instead, you play your monster cards face down, and they function as your lands. I feel like this will make gameplay really interesting, because you kind of have to weigh your options and decide if it's better to play your card early as a resource, or save it and play it as a threat in the later game. That's about it for today, but I hope you enjoyed this mini deep dive into the gameplay concept for GoblinBlitz.